Tony, thanks a lot for coming on.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
And it's an honor to speak with you and the other NDEers that I get to talk to here. Your story is particularly interesting because you were struck by lightning. I don't think I've heard of anyone else who was struck by lightning and had an NDE or lived to tell about it.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. The live to tell about it part is probably the exception.
yeah. So,
Lots of people get hit, but
yeah.
not many get to talk about it.
And I've heard of people getting hit and living about it, but they've never had an NDE, or not that I've heard of. So this is interesting. So before that happened, do you want to provide some context, or do you want to just jump straight into the story?
Sure. Before the lightning, I was still an orthopedic surgeon. I had a very busy practice in upstate New York, and it was a 12 to 14 hour a day job, and I was moving along a pathway of going into academic orthopedics. I was publishing articles. I was the chairman of a big spine course that met yearly, and so it was a busy life, and that was before the lightning. After the lightning, things changed quite a bit, but I'll talk about that as it goes.
Right. And I think it's important to highlight your background because, you're not just a crazy person. You're well educated. You're a surgeon, which is like the highest level of the medical industry that you can get to, as far as I'm concerned. So,
Well, I had an interesting life when I went to the Citadel, which was a military school, and when I was in high school, the draft was on, and I was going to get drafted. So I thought, well, if I'm going to go to war, I might as well go knowing something. And so I went to the Citadel, and while I was there, my last year, I got to spend what they call a J term, which is a winter term, up at the Woods Hole lab in Massachusetts, and I got to work with Albert St. Georgi, he was a Nobel Prize winner that came up with the mechanism of how muscle contracted. And I was convinced that I wanted to go into academics, and I wanted to get my PhD. So after I finished college, I applied to graduate school, and since I was already in Charleston, South Carolina, I decided to apply there. And I got in, and I was excited about, being a crazy scientist in the basement of some building, doing wild and crazy things. But, that was in the mid 70s, and the war ended right at my graduation from the Citadel, and I had wanted to, my plan was to go in. I wanted to be a pilot, and a few months before graduation, I had to take the physical, and I failed because I'm colorblind, and I didn't realize I was completely colorblind, at least for red and green, which are the two most used lights in an aircraft. So they said, "Sorry, buddy, you can't be a pilot, but you can be a navigator." I thought, well, so I was, and then the war ended, so everybody's contracts were cut, and everybody was sent home. So that was the end of that, and then so when I went into school, the graduate school, and I thought this will be great. And but the time I finished, there was a glut of PhDs on the market because there were lots of people that had gone to graduate school to avoid going to the draft, and they all came out at the same time. So there were no jobs, and I thought, well, what the hell? I got to do something. So I decided I would go to medical school, and so I finished my PhD and then started the next month in medical school, and then I finished that, and then I had to decide what it was I was going to do. So I had to do some soul searching to come up with what the next step was. But I had done a lot of research and I had won a lot of awards, so it was an interesting time.
Yeah, it sounds like it. So being in the medical industry, you were involved in the hard sciences. Not people in that industry generally don't believe in NDEs and mystical experiences and things like that. So that was probably interesting.
Yeah, it was when this happened, I didn't want to tell anybody because this was in 1994, and in the 90s, especially the early 90s, it wasn't something you did. I mean, if you started talking about, hey, I had this crazy experience and this out of body thing happened, and somebody would call the state and say, you better pull this guy's license because he's a little loose around the edges. So, for a long time, it was just my little experience, and I shared it with my close friends and family, and that was the way I left it.
Mm-hmm.
And then go ahead.
I was going to say that's probably smart. I've heard that before of people who are older who have had NDEs. They just kept it to themselves because people might think you're crazy and you might get thrown in an institution or something.
Yeah, even now I get, when I've done concerts and things, and people come up to me afterwards and they get real close and quiet and they go, "This happened to me." It's like, okay, but they're scared to say anything because they're afraid everybody's going to think they're a lunatic.
Right. So let's go to that day that you were struck by lightning.
So my wife had a bunch of people in her family that have birthdays in the month of August. And we would always have this communal birthday to make it easy on everybody. And she picked this place in just below Albany, New York. And the name of the place was Sleepy Hollow Lake. And the name of the town just evaporated. But at any rate, we rented a pavilion next to the lake, and we were up on the second floor with about 25 or 28 people, kids running all over the place, immediate family. And I was given the job of running the barbecue. So I was outside and I'm cooking the food. And at some point, I thought I better call my mom, make sure she's okay, because she was not going to be there. And I walked around the front of the building, and there was a payphone attached to it. And I had not been paying attention to what was going on around me because I was busy. And the morning, it was a beautiful sunny day, but sometime thereafter, it got cloudy and some storm clouds formed up over the lake, and I wasn't paying any attention. And when I walked around to talk on the phone, I called my mom, and she didn't answer. I let it ring 4 or 5, 6 times. And finally I said, all right, well, she must be busy. So I take the phone and I'm getting ready to hang it up, but I pulled it away from my face, and I hear this huge crack. and this big flash of light comes out of the phone, hits me in the face, and just threw me back like a rag doll. And I knew exactly what had happened. I'd heard lots of lightning and saw the flash, and I knew exactly what happened. And so my mind is racing, and I got thrown backwards, and suddenly I had the sensation of moving forwards, and I remembered I was standing there, and I'm absolutely befuddled. I'm like, I don't understand what's going on. I saw the lightning. I heard it. I knew I got hit. I knew I got thrown backwards. And then I had this strange feeling of moving forwards, and I was just standing there, and I couldn't make any sense of it. And I looked in front of me, and the phone is just dangling, and I'm just standing there trying to make sense of it. And all of a sudden, I hear my mother-in-law screaming, and she's at the top of the stairs. So I'm at the bottom of the stairs, and I hear her screaming, and she's running down the stairs right at me. And I thought, well, this can't be good. When your mother-in-law is screaming and running at you, it's not a good situation. So she gets down toward me, and I'm looking at her, and she's not looking at me. She's looking off to her left. And I'm like, what the hell is going on? And she gets right in front of me and turns and goes to the left, and like I wasn't there. And I turned and followed her, and I took a few steps, and all of a sudden I'm confronted with myself on the ground. And the first thing that pops into my head is, oh shit, I'm dead. And it was a shock, absolute shock, no pun intended. I just couldn't understand how there was no bells, no whistles, no notification, you have passed, you've passed go, do not collect $200. I didn't understand why there wasn't some realization. And so I walked over to my body, and I'm looking down at it, and there was a lady who was waiting to use the phone. She was there with her daughter, who was a young teenager, and they were going to call her, she was going to call her friend, the little girl was. And her mom was with her. And it turns out mom was a nurse. And, this place is in the middle of nowhere. So I'm thinking, well, it's fortuitous that there's a nurse that just happened to be here. And so she gets down, she starts to do CPR, and I'm trying to call out to everybody, and nobody can hear me or see me. And I'm like, well, hell, there's no point in staying here. So I turned around, and I started to go up the stairs. I thought, well, I might as well go see what's going on with my family. And as I was starting to go up the stairs, I'm looking down at the stairs, because I customarily would do that so I don't trip and fall on my face. And as I got to about the third step, I remembered, as I'm looking down, I see my legs are starting to dissolve. And I thought, whoa, this is getting kind of crazy now. And by the time I got to the top of the stairs, I was just a ball of energy. And when you get to the top of the stairs, you have to go to the left. And I didn't go through the left. I just went straight through the wall. And when I came out, I was passed right over my wife's head. She was sitting painting children's faces, and I memorized who was there, in what position they were standing, and in what order, and how the table and chairs were all arranged. And at the time, I didn't understand why I made a mental note of that, but it became important later when we were comparing notes, and I had seen all those things. And then as I went diagonally through the room, and when I got to the ceiling, I went right through. And then it really got interesting, because all of a sudden it was like I had been dropped into a river of pure positive energy. And there was this bright bluish white light in the distance, and this energy was coming from that. And as I was standing there looking at it, dumbfounded is if you can imagine absolute love and absolute peace. That was the only qualities of this energy, this positive energy stream that was coming from the light. And as I was looking at it, I'm trying to make sense of it, I'm looking at this energy, and actually I could see the energy, and I could actually see the waveforms, and I could see this almost look like a sine wave that was running through everything. And as I looked at different structures and trees and hills, I could see that this energy was what made everything. And I remember thinking, this must be the God energy. And I thought, this is so palpable, I could measure this. My, science brain started to kick in, and I'm thinking, I could measure this, and how stupid am I? But, that was just the way it was going. And it, I was just thinking, this is the greatest thing that could ever happen to anyone. And at that point, I realized that, I'm going someplace. I could feel I had the sensation of moving, and it had speed and direction. I don't know where I was going, but I was going someplace. And as I was traveling in this energy stream, I started to see a collage, if you will, of high points, low points in my life. And it wasn't any in-depth explanation or discussion. It was just, it really was a collage of pictures. And then as I'm going along, I'm thinking, God, I just can't wait to go wherever this is taking me, because it's the most incredible feeling. And then all of a sudden, it was like somebody flipped a switch, and I was back in my body, and it hurt like hell. I mean, where it hit me in the face and went out my foot, I had burns in both places, and it hurt like a son of a gun. And I thought, what the hell? I don't want to go through this. And I remember, saying out loud to myself, don't make me go back. But I rapidly realized that's not my decision. And so I'm still unconscious. And it seemed like it took minutes before I could open my eyes. And the lady who was next to me had stopped CPR. And so she was just kneeling there. And when I was able to open my eyes, I wanted to say something like, thank you for helping me. But the only thing that came out was, it's okay, I'm a doctor. And she just laughed and said, you weren't a moment ago. And I thought, okay, I've got some circuits that are not working well, so I'm just going to shut up. And at that point, they called the police, they called an ambulance, and I refused to go to the hospital. I said, you're either alive or dead when you get hit by lightning, and I'm alive, so I don't see any point in going. It was pretty stupid too, but I wasn't thinking very clearly. So I asked my family to take me home so I could see my cardiologist and my neurologist friends. And I called them on the way, and they saw me when I got there, and checked me out and said, yeah, well, you're alive. That's the best of all outcomes. And I'd be thankful that you are. And at that point, I thought, okay, now what do I do? And it took about a week for me to be able to go back to work. And it took a few days, because for whatever reason, I could look at you and know your name, but damn if I could find it. It was, I could tell that the circuits were scrambled, and I didn't have, command of, I couldn't remember diseases, the name of them. I could tell you anything about them, but couldn't remember the name, people's names. And after a week, that all disappeared. And I remember thinking, what the hell? What was this all about? So I was really haunted by that. And, I started trying to find any book that I could on people who'd been struck by lightning and, what happened to them. And that was an incredible experience right from the get-go. And at that point, I had, I went back to work, and within a couple of weeks of going back to work, I start to have this insatiable desire to hear classical piano music, which was a departure for me. I was a kid of the 60s. There was rock and roll. There wasn't much of anything else. My mother had made me take piano lessons when I was 7 years old for a year, and which I did out of threat of bodily harm. But after that year, I just, I had no interest in it. So, I bailed, never went back. And now all of a sudden I'm being haunted by it. And so it was so strong that I actually went to Albany, New York, which is an hour away from where we live, to find a place that had some classical CDs. And I walked in the store, and this CD from Vladimir Ashkenazy, who was a famous Russian pianist, just jumped off the shelf into my hands. And he was playing his favorite Chopin. And I started listening to it, and I was absolutely consumed by it. I listened to it all day long. I made everybody else listen to it. And I'm sure that they were sick of it, because I was doing it at work. I was doing it at home. And within a very short period, I came to the realization that it wasn't going to be enough to listen to this. I wanted to be able to play it, which was a problem since I didn't have a piano and I didn't know how to play. So, I was starting out with nothing. And after that realization, it seemed like it was the next day, one of our babysitters came and said, I've got to move, and I have this old upright piano. I was wondering if I could get you to store it in your house for a year till I get settled. Because, it was my father's and I don't want to part with it. And I said, sure. So now all of a sudden I have a piano. I went and bought some books on trying to teach myself how to play, which is kind of magical thinking. But at that point, I was doing a lot of that. And so I bought some books, and I'm trying to teach myself some basics. And within a couple of weeks of that, I have a dream. And in this dream, I'm walking out onto a stage, and as I'm walking toward myself, so it's like an out-of-body experience in a dream. And I'm in a concert hall. I'm up on the front of the stage, and I'm playing to an audience of people. And as I'm walking toward myself, I'm listening to the music, and I come to the realization, this is not somebody else's music, this is mine. And I thought, okay, well, I better listen. So as I'm walking toward myself, I'm listening to what's being played, and I'm standing behind myself, and I listen to the music, and the ending of the music has this kind of loud crashing ending, and it wakes me up. And I sit up on the edge of the bed, and I look at the clock. It's 3:15, and I get up and I go out to the piano, and I'm trying to plunk out different things that I heard, but I had no idea how to play it, and I had no idea how to write it. So I went back to bed, and I got up and went to work. But from that moment on, whenever I sat down at the piano, the music would start playing in my head, and it was always the same. It was like it was burned into my brain, and it was there to be played all the time. And it became like a little 2-year-old. It's like if I didn't pay attention to it, it would become indignant, and it would start to play louder. it would start to interfere with what I was doing. So if I'm trying to do surgery and I haven't been paying attention to the music, it starts playing in my head, and it's like very it's distracting. And so I started, I had a routine where I got up at 4:30 in the morning, and I would practice until 6:30, and I would go to work, and I would come home, and then I put the kids to bed, and then I was back at the piano, and I would stay there trying to learn how to play, and trying to learn how to play that music till 1 o'clock in the morning, and I would get up and do everything all over again each day. So it really took a toll on my family life and my life overall from that standpoint, because I was so consumed by it, and I really believe that the only reason I was here was because of the music. So it seemed like that was my raison d'etre, as they say. And so I kept working on it, and I had, as part of trying to learn how to play, I had ordered the sheet music from all the things that were on that CD, which was crazy to think that, you could just do that and learn how to play it. But I was determined to try, and I was trying to learn a piece of music called the Fantasy Impromptu. It's a Chopin piece. And I was really trying hard to get this piece to work. Mm-hmm. And I was struggling. And my daughter's best friend, Jackie, was over at the house, and her mom, Penny, had stopped to pick her up. And Penny came in, and she heard me banging on the piano, and she came in and said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I can't understand this." I said, "The hands don't line up." And I said, "Why would somebody write a piece of music where the hands don't line up?" And she looked at me and she said, "They're not supposed to. That's a polyrhythm." And I'm like, "What's a polyrhythm?" And she said, "I'm not even going to attempt to explain this to you." She said, "You need a teacher." Mm-hmm. And so she recommended Sandy McCain, who was the chairman of the music department at Hartwick College. And I called Sandy and I explained this whole thing to her and asked her if she would take me on as a student, which she did. And we worked from that moment on. We worked 2 hours a week. And the only time that we had in common was at 5 a.m. So that was our time. So we would work. I had from 5 to 6 each, so we did 2 days, Thursday and Fridays, from 5 to 6, which is crazy. I think her family was ready to throw me out. But we started on that pathway, and so the music from the dream was just constantly playing. Whenever I was near the piano or I was quiet, it would just start. And so it was very haunting. And I would try to write down little snippets of it. And, I had no idea how to write music, but I could write down a few notes and I put it all in a drawer, and I thought someday I'll get back to this. And so that whole process started in 1994. And then now it's fast forward, it's 2002. I start going to a piano camp for adults called the Sonata, which was in Bennington, Vermont. And so in 2002, I started going to the Sonata piano camp for adult. And it's, 30 plus people who are all consumed by piano, and they would go to these meetings, and you spent a week there, and it was an old nunnery, and there was a piano in every room. It was a crazy time, and you got to play all day long. And so that was, very indulgent, but it was a great time. and so I had learned a lot about playing and enjoying that experience. And so I started going each year. And in 2006, when I went, there was a change. The owner, her name is Polly. Her sister, Erica, was the #1 salesperson at Steinway in New York City. And she had left Steinway and went to Bosendorf for a different brand. And she showed up at piano camp with 5 Bosendorfer pianos for people to play, as an advertisement. But she and I got talking about this whole Lightning thing and the music, because she had noticed that I was playing music that she thought was way above what I would be expected to be able to play at that period of time. And so she found that interesting, that I had this aptitude. And we were talking about the Lightning, and she said, this is a great story. There's only one person that can tell it, and that's Oliver Sacks. At the time, I didn't know Oliver other than the fact that he had written the book Awakenings about his experiences with Parkinson's and how he solved the riddle. But I didn't think anything of it, and I thought, well, that was an interesting conversation. And so I went back to my regular business. But then a couple months later, I get a phone call from Oliver Sacks. So now it's 2006, and Oliver says, I've heard about this story, and I was wondering if you'd come to New York City and be interviewed, because I'd like you to be one of my patients. I have a group of people like you who've had strange experiences and have developed unusual talents as a result of it. And so I did. In August of 2006, I went down and I spent a full day with Oliver, which was an incredible experience. And as we're saying goodbye, I'm standing in his doorway, and he looks at me. And Oliver had this way of, when he looked at you, he could just, like, he's looking right through you. And he said, the music from the dream went through an awful lot of trouble to get here. The least you can do is write it. And I was so taken by that coming from him that I was determined that when I got home, that was what I was going to do. But I still didn't know how to write anything. So I went to the store and I bought a program called Sibelius, which is writing music for dummies. And the beauty of this was that it's a computerized program, and the music that's from the dream is always the same. So I spent the next 7 months every night, and I would write something in the computer, and I would listen to it, and it would either match the recording or it didn't. And so there was a lot of trial and error of getting it exactly the way I heard it, because what I heard was always in my head was always playing the same. So I had an internal control. And when I finished writing it in time for my 2007 music camp, which was in May. And I played the piece for the group, and it was well received. And I thought, well, this is pretty cool. And while I was there, I got a call from Oliver, and he says, I wanted to ask your permission to use your story in my book, which was called Musicophilia. And he said, it's going to be coming out, and I wanted you to be in it. And I said, sure. I don't have anything to hide. Mm-hmm. And he said, good, because you're chapter 1, and it's coming out in the New Yorker magazine on July 23rd. I'm like, oh. And so I wasn't expecting that, but I thought, okay, and be that as it may. So, July 23rd comes along, and the article comes out about me, and of course the phone starts ringing off the hook. And I got one of the first calls was from a friend of mine, Carlton Clay, who was the head of music at the State University in New York in Oneonta, where they have a music program. And he said, I read the New Yorker magazine. He said, I'd like you to come and teach a class. And I thought, well, that would be interesting. A couple of weeks later, he calls back and he says, geez, could you play for the class? And I said, okay, I could do that. And so then it seemed like a month later, he calls again and he says, it's getting kind of crazy. We're getting all these calls. And would you consider doing a concert at the Performing Arts Center? And I said, no. I said, I don't have the faintest idea how to do something like that. And he kept calling, and he cons me into it, and I agreed. And I called my teacher Sandy, and I said, Carlton has conned me into doing this. I said, is there any way you can get me ready for this? Mm-hmm. And she said, yeah. She said, but it's going to take you a minimum of 3 to 4 hours a day, and you're going to have to make a huge commitment. And so we started working, and she would take me up to the Performing Arts Center and make me walk out on the stage and talk and play, and just went through this whole thing. And I had to learn how to do all of that and how to get the music ready to be played at that level. And as I was going along this process, Carlton called again and he said, you won't believe this, he says, but we have some television crews that want to be there. And I'm like, you got to be kidding me. How are they finding this stuff? And I agreed, because by this point I've already committed myself. Mm-hmm. And so the week of the concert, which is going to be in January of 2008, and all of a sudden the BBC One is there, and Granada Media and German television. So I've got 3 studios are packed in this Performing Arts Center. And I remember walking out on the stage and I thought, oh dear God, I'm going to turn and run. And it's like, and I remember when I went to the green room beforehand, and I remember saying my prayers, and I said to God and whoever was listening, said, you went through a lot of trouble to make me come here. I said, please don't abandon me and embarrass us both.
Right.
So thankfully they didn't. I managed to get through the whole concert without embarrassing myself, which I guess was my biggest fear. And everything was true to the music, which was what I wanted it to be. So that was, that took me to that point. And then it took on a life of its own, and I've played the music all over the place, different venues and different concert halls. And it has continued. But the thing that was so dramatically pointed out to me as I was going through this was that there's no such thing as death. You don't die. You change forms, and that's to be expected. But our spirit lives on. Mm-hmm. And I remembered as I was standing there looking at my body, and my mind is racing, and I'm thinking, oh my God, I'm thinking just like I normally would. and in the same vernacular that I would normally think. And so it became very clear to me that whoever we are, we always are. And this is, this shell that we're in at this moment is nothing more than that. And certainly we come back many times and go through this. So it's, it made me less religious, but much more spiritual. Because clearly the things that I learned from the experience, did not fit necessarily with what I was taught. I was brought up as a Catholic, and certainly a lot of that flies in the face of Catholicism, but it made me much more spiritual from the standpoint that I know that there's something more that exists, and I know that there is a great and loving source. People call it God, but whatever the source is, or whoever it is certainly the force that makes up everything, and we're all part of it. So it was pretty much an incredible experience.
Oh, I agree. Absolutely. It's definitely incredible. So was the Lightning Sonata the first piece of music that you created?
Yes.
Okay.
That was the one that launched me along this pathway. And then, but that piece, was just given to me. And it's interesting that all the music that I have written it's like there's a channel that music is on that I can connect to, and it downloads information to me. I don't know where it is. I don't know if it's, is it part of the fabric of the universe? I have no idea. But at any rate, it's there, and I'm able to tap into it. And it's not unlike what other people have said. The great composers have all said, the music is given to me. Mozart was famous for it, and he said that the music would come in a complete form, and all he had to do was write it down. And Beethoven said the same sort of thing. It's like, this is the way it was given to me. I'm not changing anything. And Brahms, same thing. He always said that he had a muse that would connect with him and would give him the music. So it does come from some place. And I don't know what the place is, but somehow people are able to connect, and so I don't know. I wish I did know exactly how it worked, but I suspect it's part of the quantum energy field that people talk about, and somehow that everything is stored in there in some fashion, and our brains are not really a storehouse of information, but is a receiver of some sorts, and it gives us access to tune into that. And one of the things that come out of all this is I was also studied by Daryl Treeford, who is a physician who is a specialist in savants. And he has a group of people that have all had, something weird happen to them. They either had brain surgery, they had trauma, they got hit in the head with something. But out of it, they've all developed an unusual ability that they didn't have before. And which is interesting because if it can happen by accident, we should be able to make it happen willfully. We haven't learned how to do that, and I'm sure that there is a mechanism that we have forgotten over eons of time. But the fact that it can happen to people from trauma unknowingly, then we should be able to duplicate that. But at this point, nobody's come up with it and figuring out how to do that.
Right.
But I do believe it's there.
Yeah, I agree. I was listening to someone not too long ago. I think it was Billy Carson who said that, that might have been our normal state. And then over the millennia, we sort of lost those abilities for whatever reason, trauma.
You got to love Billy Carson.
Right. Yep.
I love listening to him.
So, I listened to the piano sonata, and it's brilliant. And as a piano man myself, I can appreciate it a lot more than maybe someone who's not. And, I've only been playing for maybe 4.5, 5 years. And I can tell you that for the first song, if that's your first song that you came up with, I mean, it's definitely profound. I'm just now trying to create my own music, and it's not anywhere near that. It's bits and pieces.
Yeah.
But on the note of hearing music, I think that's actually quite common for some musicians. I mean, I've been hearing music since I was a kid, not complete compositions like yourself, but, literally auditory hallucinations or whatever you want to call them in 5-10 seconds or something like that. So it's probably not as uncommon as people would think.
Yeah, I agree. It's people have it all the time.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, the having it activated by some kind of traumatic event, that's really interesting. And the sudden savant syndrome, I think it's called. There's a lot of abilities that people get: math skills, music, languages, art. Yeah. I mean, it's really quite amazing.
It's interesting. I got to meet a lot of those people, and it was incredible. They were one thing one day, and they had something the next that they didn't expect, and it's pretty neat to be able to go through that.
Yeah, I bet. So as a medical professional, what do you think is going on when people have NDEs? I'm sure that you've assessed your experience a million times over.
Yeah. And, essentially we have two parts. We have a physical part and a non-physical part. The non-physical part is our spiritual energy. And that part is immortal. It goes on. Unless you get caught up in an atomic bomb or something like that, which I did read something about how that is one of the things that is a major consequence of an atomic explosion, is that people's spirits are harmed, in addition to their body, but the massive energy causes damage to their spiritual form as well. But I do believe that we are eternal, that we're here for a reason, and I think that reason is you have to. Our purpose all along is to be able to join the source from where we came, but it's not a free card. You actually have to earn it. And so by going through reincarnation and you're coming through this multiple times, you learn, you make mistakes, but even those you learn from, and so you go through a process of spiritual evolution. And so we're all in what's called third density, third dimension. And our goal is to ascend fourth, fifth, sixth, seven, eight. But there's an awful lot of growth that has to take place for you to make that next leap. And this is just part of that process.
Mm-hmm.
And hopefully by the time you spend, a million years of spiritual evolution, you get to where you're supposed to be.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting that you brought up the atomic explosions. I was listening to someone the other day, I think it was Preston Dennett, who's a UFO researcher, and I think it was him. They were saying that the reason why some of these extraterrestrial civilizations allegedly are coming here or are interested in humans is that we have nuclear weapons, and somehow that it not only messes things up physically, but interdimensionally, it sort of warps things and it can cause harm. So that's an interesting association.
I follow Dr. Greer. I don't know if you know him, Stephen Greer.
Yeah.
He has written numerous books and has been someone who probably is the world's authority on extraterrestrial civilizations. And that's, one of the things that he was told by them through, I don't remember the exact sequence of how that came to be known, but that's one of the things that does happen. It can distort interdimensional reality and can affect the spiritual energy as well.
Are you still religious? You mentioned you were a Catholic.
Originally, I was Catholic, and I became much less religious from the standpoint of, I stopped going to church, but I became much more spiritual in the standpoint that, I firmly believe in an after, and I firmly believe in God and spirits. So, these are all things that I saw firsthand. So I'm absolutely convinced that those things exist. And I try to fit it into the framework of what I know to be true.
Did you encounter any beings or entities when you were gone?
No, I was very disappointed that I never got to meet any people, and lots of people who've had this experience have had those experiences, and I felt kind of left out that I didn't. But I'm sure that there was a reason that I didn't have it. I don't happen to know what it is, but somebody else does. But it was, and I've talked to lots of people who've had experiences where they, met up with somebody, and somebody off the top of my head, Mary Neal, who's a spine surgeon in Wyoming, and Mary was kayaking, whitewater kayaking in South America someplace, and went over a falls and drowned. And she was dead for almost 20 minutes. And then they found her and were able to resuscitate her, and she had the whole out of body experience, and she met with someone, and they told her, one of the things they told her was that her son, when he turned 19 years old, would die. And I thought, how's that for a thing that you don't want to know? And it did happen. Shortly after he turned that age, and he was killed in a car accident. And I think one of the most famous cases is Pamela Reynolds. Pam Reynolds was a lady who had an aneurysm in her brain. So it's a balloon from a blood vessel that was going to burst. And she had to have surgery, and they sent her out to Phoenix, Arizona, to the Spetzler Institute. And the doctor was a neurosurgeon. He had pioneered this procedure called standstill, where they would, to keep you from bleeding to death during a surgery like that, they put you on a heart bypass, and then they would drain all the blood out of your brain. And you could, your brain would be all right for a limited period of time for the surgery. And they did this surgery with her. And when she woke up in the recovery room, she started talking to them about the equipment that they were using, the people who were in the room, what the people were saying, and things that there's no possible way for her to know, because she was clinically brain dead and cardiac dead. I mean, they had stopped her brain and stopped her heart completely, and monitored it. And so, she had no physical manifestation in this world, but yet she knew all those things. And she talked about how she had left her body, and she was, perched on the surgeon's shoulder watching all this stuff. And then she, this tunnel opened up, and she went in the tunnel, and she met up with some of her family, and they walked with her for a little while, and they brought her back and said, "You have to go back." And she said, "No, I'm not going back." And one of her relatives pushed her out of the tunnel, which coincided with them restarting her heart. But it was an interesting, it's an interesting story, and she gives a great account if you ever get a chance to read about it. But she was, and she was on television and all kinds of news things, and talked about it. So it's well documented. But I don't remember what my point was.
Yeah, no worries. How do most medical people react to this kind of stuff who haven't had an experience of their own?
There was a reason I didn't talk about it initially. Right. When Oliver got hold of it, Oliver took it out of the closet, so to speak. And at that point, it was okay to talk about it because Oliver Sacks had talked about it, and he was a famous person that everybody respected. So it was okay to talk about it now. But before that, it was dangerous to talk about for the reasons I've already talked about. And I wasn't going to subject myself to that kind of ridicule. And so the medical profession has been very slow to accept anything new. And certainly this falls into that category. And I have been involved in making films that are for medical professionals about near death and how to help people who've had one, and help them to get through it without causing a lot of psychological damage. And I've actually been involved in teaching some medical students at different universities about all of this stuff and how to approach people who've had one. So it's come a long way, but it's still got a long ways to go.
Do you think that the next generation of medical practitioners coming up now are more open to this stuff?
I think they are, and I think that it's been a slow process,
Mhm.
and the medical schools have not been quick to jump in and teach this stuff, but schools are starting to be more receptive to it and realize that, yeah, this is a problem that we have to address. We may not have many answers for it, but enough people are having these things happen that they need to be able to help. I mean, that's the whole point of the medical profession, is to help other people, and this is just one of the ways.
Are you familiar? Are you familiar with the University of Virginia research with
Yep.
Dr.
That's
Bruce
right.
Grayson?
That's where I went to school.
Okay, good.
Yep.
Good.
And Bruce Grayson and there's a whole host of folks that are involved in the UVA program with that.
Mhm. Yeah, they're doing some really interesting work. I'd love to get them on at some point. But I mean, that's been going on for decades, that project.
Yep, it sure has. And they've done great work, and they're well respected.
Absolutely. So one more thing before we end this. Do you still hear the music, by the way?
Oh
Pretty
yeah.
good stuff. You do?
Yep. Yeah, I still, I make time to sit, and usually it comes when I'm doodling at the piano. And just sit down at the piano, and somehow sitting there, and it opens my mind to whatever is coming. And I've had pieces of music just download the whole thing, and it's like, and it's almost stunning.
Yeah.
But it still comes, and I've gotten a little bit better at being able to write things down. So I can, and even if I don't have time to go in depth to it, once I've had the experience of having the music come to me, it's easy to go back to it.
Are you familiar with the concept of channeling?
Yep.
So is that kind of what this is, essentially?
It's a good question. I don't know if it's channeling. It could be.
Yeah.
Certainly it could be coming from someone or someplace. And I suppose that channeling is a good way of looking at it, because you're opening your mind to information that's coming from someplace else.
Yeah.
But it certainly is it feels a bit like that.
Right. Yeah, I'm hesitant to bring on channelers because I think there's a lot of opportunity for con artists to manipulate that.
Yeah, and there's no way to quantify how much of it is real and how much is not real.
Right.
But by the same token, there's an awful lot of information that they can present. And if you're getting the same information from 5 or 6 different sources, you have to start to think, okay, there's something to this.
Right. I look at kind of like what the Christian faith says, look at their fruits, right? So I think if if the information that they're providing or the work that they've done is legitimate or, is consistent with other stuff, then they might be legit. Um, but yeah, when I heard of your story and when I think about kind of some of the music that I hear every now and then, not like yours, but bits and pieces, I guess you could call that channeling. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a person or something sending
Right.
it to you. It could just be like, as you said, sort of the quantum intelligence or Akashic record or something like that, or whatever you want to call it, that you're tapping into. And that's maybe where people are getting and where you got your music. But it also kind of sounds like something was prompting you. You mentioned it was kind of like a 2-year-old that wouldn't leave you alone. So it's almost
Yeah,
like the music wanted to come out. It had a
it
life
really
of its
did.
own.
It,
It,
the lightning piece was like that.
mhm,
Um, the other music that's come has not been as insistent as that piece was.
mhm.
And I don't understand the difference, but the lightning piece was truly different than the rest of the music that I have received,
Mhm.
because it was demanding. It was like, I have something to say and you need to listen. And I'm like, okay. And, and I still don't know the full extent of it.
Mhm.
And I really suspect that there are frequencies in the music that stimulate DNA in our brains, and can foster an evolution of thought.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
and I think there's more to it than I have any idea. But I'm hopeful that as time goes along, some of the stuff will become clearer,
Yeah.
and it may even have something to do with health.
Mhm.
There's lots of research that's being done about how musical frequencies can affect people's health as well. So,
Mhm.
it's is the amount of information that it kind of dovetails with it is really staggering.
Right. And if people listen to the sonata, it's funny that you mentioned that it kind of felt like it had something to say and you're going to hear it. Because when you listen to it, it kind of feels like that too. It has
Yeah,
something to say and you want to listen to it. It's a it's an interesting piece. It's sort of mysterious and purposeful at the same time. That's how I
yeah,
would describe it.
yeah. It is, and there are points in it that are very much like that,
Mhm.
where it's like, okay, you know, where am I? Where is this taking me?
Yeah, yeah.
But it's clearly, you know, orchestrated by something that wants you to follow a pathway,
Mhm.
and
Eh,
uh, and it does, and there are lots of interesting things of, I remember thinking I, as I was as I listened to the music, that there's a battle between good and evil, and in the third movement in particular, there's this very demonstrative, um, darker side, and then this angelic voice comes in from someplace else, and they're moving back and forth between the two,
mhm.
and then somehow there's a resolution between them, and they become one, at the end, which to me an interesting parallel.
Yeah. I hadn't thought about it like that. It's almost like a story, and a good story has a meta narrative that you might not consciously be aware of.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like that.
Yeah.
And it's interesting what you said about the music having an effect on you that you might not realize, activating DNA or something like that. There's another guy who is similar to you. I don't think he had an NDE, but it was a spiritually transformative experience, and with angels or something. And he came back with the ability to play the harp. And he was saying the same thing, that there's something in the way that he plays the music that sort of could potentially, elevate the listener or something like that. Yeah, I think you're definitely onto something with that, and we don't quite understand it yet, but as we have these kinds of conversations and as professional researchers look into this stuff, it's going to be we'll figure it out at some point. So if people want to reach out to you or find your music, do you have a website or something? I know you have a YouTube channel.
Actually, I don't have a website. I need to go through the trouble of getting one.
Yeah.
But I haven't done it. I just never got around to it. But the music is available on most of the customary sites.
Mm-hmm.
I know that it's you can get it from originally it was put on CD Baby,
Mm-hmm.
which was the original site, but then they farm it out to Spotify and every possible digital music sales venue that there is. So it's always out there.
Right.
If somebody wants the CD, they can get it from me. They can write to me. My email is just tcicoria@yahoo.com.
Mm-hmm.
And so if somebody has a specific question or something, they can feel free to shoot me an email.
Mm-hmm. And I would encourage people to go listen to the Lightning Sonata. It's good. And
Thank you.
Yeah.
I wish I could take credit for it, but
right.
I was I was just the receiver.
Right. The instrument.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Do you have other songs, other compositions on an album, or is it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. The CD that was published there's three things on it. There's the Lightning Sonata, which is actually, it's not a sonata form from a musicology standpoint. It's actually
Mm-hmm.
it's not, it doesn't follow the sonata rules.
Mm-hmm.
But be that as it may, it was subtitled. It's actually a fantasy in form, musical form, but it's subtitled The Lightning Sonata.
Is the sheet music available for the song?
Yeah.
Okay.
I have, you have to get it from me because I had it published and I never sent it out to the publishing house.
Mm-hmm.
And originally I was just going to have my plan was to get an Amazon showroom and sell stuff out of that, and never got around to doing that either. So, but if somebody's interested, I can get them the music.
Good. Well, Tony, thank you so much for doing this.
Oh, absolutely. My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.